In my last video, I made a miniature sewing machine and cabinet for Aunt Clara's sewing nook. Today I'm going to show you how I made all of the tiny sewing notions, vintage-inspired pattern envelopes, and a miniature sewing basket, all in 1/16 scale. There's a lot to enjoy in this one, so let's get started. Let's start with some buttons. Aunt Clara loves her buttons. I'm using a Q-tip and a cake pop stick carefully sliced into tiny rounds. Please watch your fingers with this part. This is a great little trick if you don't have beads on hand, or just want a bit of variety. I painted them all at once and then laid them out individually to dry. I glued the free printable 1/16 scale button cards onto some white cardstock. There's also a 1/12 version if you're working in that scale. After cutting them out, I inked the edges with a little distress ink to give them some depth. Then comes the fun part, arranging the buttons onto the cards. I used the ones I made earlier and added in a few seed beads too. I love how the seed beads look like tiny buttons all on their own. To finish, I dropped a little blob of diamond glaze on top of each handmade button. It gives them a polished look, like tiny buttons ready to be stitched onto one of Aunt Clara's special outfits. I imagine these little cards will hold bias tape, seam binding, or maybe even ribbon. I glued them onto brown cardstock and inked the edges, just like I did with the button cards. Then I wrapped some really thin ribbon around them a couple of times. They're just right for Aunt Clara's stash. If you happen to need some scissors for your miniature scene, these make a great little prop. I left space to fold the paper in half to make it sturdier, and then pressed it flat. Personally, I found it easier to cut them out while the paper was still a little damp. Except for the inside edges, I waited until those were dry first. To build up each side, I added a layer of wood glue and let it dry completely. I painted them gray first, then dabbed on a bit of metallic silver. From here you'll have to decide if you want yours glued open or closed. Of course, you could always paint the handles a different color too. Now let's make some thread spools. The cake pop stick is a perfect size for these. I marked out where I wanted to cut them first. I'm not sure who to give credit to, but cutting round things on sandpaper, total game changer. Thank you to whoever came up with that. You could cut out a label, but I decided to draw mine on with a marker instead. Then I added a teeny tiny dot on each end to suggest the holes. For the thread, I used some leftover embroidery floss. I didn't separate the strands, I just rolled it onto the spool, making sure that they laid side by side so it would look a little bit more realistic. I'm not sure what Aunt Clara would think if she saw my messy leftover threads. She likes all her thread neat and perfectly organized. Using a Q-tip, I'm making some vintage-style wooden spools. I cut one to the size I wanted and used it as a guide for the rest. Then I cut some small circles to glue to each end of the Q-tip. If you want the ends to look a little heavier, just glue 2 circles to each side instead. I painted them all at once with a light tan to a soft brown color, and then I laid them out individually to dry just like I did with the buttons. I'm not exactly sure what this thread is called. It's kind of like embroidery floss, but it doesn't separate the same way. I just liked that it had a different texture, something to keep things interesting. I glued it on the same way I did the previous spools and tried not to fill them up too much so they would look used. Then I added the tiny holes again on the ends using a fine tip brown marker. These turned out to be my favorite. I have a feeling Aunt Clara is going to need a few more in her stash. Since Aunt Clara makes a lot of her own clothes, I imagine she'd need spools of satin ribbon in all sorts of colors. I went digging through my circle stash to find just the right size for the spool ends. For the center, I rolled up a strip of paper tightly, then I roughly marked each section to cut. Scissors made it quick and easy to cut them apart. They looked a little rough, but that's fine, because you're not going to see the inside anyway. and after cutting they were a bit flat, so I had to reshape them using a skewer, then glued a circle to each end. I painted them and aged them a bit, and you could even add tiny labels if you want. I have a bunch of satin type ribbon I never seemed to be able to use. This was perfect. I cut small sections in a few different colors, and then I brushed on some Mod Podge to stiffen the ribbon and to keep it from unraveling. After letting it dry, I glued it to the spool first, just to make winding it easier. The nice thing is you can cut the ribbon to whatever width you need, and because they're treated, they won't fray. I can just imagine how excited Aunt Clara is going to be to add these to her collection. I love using Tyvek. It feels like paper, but it doesn't tear the way paper does. So that's what I'm using to make the tape measure. If you don't have Tyvek, regular paper works too. Just double it up. That's actually how I made the earlier ones for Aunt Clara. I painted mine that classic tape measure yellow, but really any color will do. Then I used a fine tip pen to mark the ruler lines, up one side and down the other. Don't forget to do both sides. For the little metal tips on each end, I just dip them in metallic silver paint. You can never have too many of these. Here are the vintage pattern envelopes I want to share with you. If you'd like them to look aged, you can use chalk pastels or distress inks. That way you can control the amount of how vintage you want them to feel. I've always had a weakness for old patterns, probably because my grandmother saved every single one she ever owned. To make cutting easier, I lined up each row and column on the printable. I start by scoring the flaps. I line up my ruler and use the back of my blade to make the fold lines. Then, without moving the ruler, I go ahead and cut. I do this in both directions, and then I use scissors to finish off those angled edges. Once they're cut out, I fold the scored flaps in first. To make the envelopes look like they have something inside, I doubled up some cardstock strips and glued a small piece inside each one. Then I add glue to the side flaps and fold the back over to close it up. You can glue the top flap down or leave it open. It's totally up to you. Aunt Clara has them tucked away in baskets and hat boxes, pretty much anywhere she can squeeze them in. I also wanted to make a few uncut pattern pieces. I trimmed off the extra border from a real pattern to use. But if you don't have any on hand, a dried tea bag works great too once it's flattened out. Maybe even better, it already looks a little vintage. I traced out some pattern shapes onto regular paper, then layered the pattern tissue over the top to trace. I tried both a black pen and a brown one, and the black ended up being my favorite. I scrunched mine up a little bit because, well, my patterns were always wrinkly anyway. You can fold a few pieces up and glue them halfway into the envelope so they look like they're sticking out, since, let's be honest, they never quite folded the same way twice. I think they look right at home all packed into that little hat box, just like Aunt Clara would have done. Now let's make that traditional red pincushion, or at least something pretty close to it. I started by tracing a circle about 2 or 3 times larger than I wanted the pincushion to be. Before I cut it out, I brushed a little glue just inside the traced edge to help prevent fraying, and stitched a simple gathering stitch just below the glued edge. I gently pulled it into a little cup shape and tucked in a little bit of batting, or in my case, I used some cotton from a vitamin bottle. Then I drew the thread up tight to close it up and finished it off. I used a couple of strands of embroidery floss to give the pincushion that sculpted look. I ran the thread up through the bottom and back again to make 4 evenly spaced sections. For the top, I didn't have green fabric or felt, so I made a little French knot with embroidery floss. If the needle's tough to pull through, like it was for me, needle nose pliers really help. To make a sewing box like Aunt Clara's, I started with 2 strips of paper, one for the height of the bottom and a shorter one for the lid. I wrapped one of the strips around something round Then let it expand until it filled the size I wanted using my circle template as a guide. While holding it in place, I added a little glue to the inside end to secure it. Then I gently pulled from the outside to tighten up the coils. I came in about 2 inches from the end and added some glue to hold everything together. Here I'm gently squeezing the circle into an oval shape. It works best if the glue end ends up on the top or the bottom. I already made the lid, so I'm matching the shape for the bottom. Once it's where I want it, I glue it down onto the cardstock just like I did the lid. You don't have to stick with an oval either. I also tried a rounded square shape, and that worked out nicely too. Be sure to add glue around the top edge and wipe away any excess. Once it's dry, I cut it out from the cardstock. In a previous video, I made a vintage hamper using this potato bag mesh to give it that basket texture. I glued it down to cardstock first, and then I cut away what I needed, but that was a little tricky for something as small as a sewing box. Ask me how I know. So this time I'm gluing the mesh directly onto the bottom and the top with wood glue instead. I wrapped it around twice, I think. It can get a little messy, but I thought it was worth it. Once it was completely dry, I trimmed away the extra, and it actually cuts really nicely and cleanly too. Hold the pieces together and decide which sides look best for the front. One of my sides was a little flat, so I used that as the back. For the hinges, I used little strips of Tyvek. I glued them onto the bottom first, then onto the lid. I have to admit though, I kept moving them around because I just couldn't make up my mind where I wanted them. You can braid or twist some crochet thread to make a cord. I had this little bit left over from Aunt Clara's, so I reused that. On hers, I glued the cording closer to the top, but this time I attached it near the bottom. I also glued crochet thread around the top edge of the bottom piece and the bottom edge of the lid. I didn't open the lid fully yet. I just made sure I wasn't accidentally gluing it shut. For the top of the sewing box, I traced the shape of the basket onto the cardstock and trimmed it to fit. Then I added a couple layers of paper towel to give it some padding. You could use batting too if you prefer. I glued that padded piece down onto my fabric, then trimmed around it, leaving a small border to fold over and finish the edges. Paint it however you like. I went with an off-white again, followed by a light brown wash to age it a little, and don't forget to paint the inside too. I traced the basket one more time to create the inside pouch. This time I cut it a little bit bigger on purpose. I folded it over, leaving a little extra at the bottom to turn over for a cleaner edge. Once it's turned, check that it's just a little wider than the inside of the lid. I ran a gathering stitch near the top to give it that stretchy pouch-like look. You may have to check the fit and draw it in a bit more. Don't glue it in just yet. I laid a few tiny sewing pieces over it to see what I could fit inside. Once I had it figured out, I removed the pouch and glued those pieces behind it. Then I glued the pouch into place on the lid. Here's how mine's looking at this point. Now comes the fun part. Glue in your tiny sewing notions however you'd like. If you're planning to open and close the basket, make sure it still shuts properly. Here's mine filled up with all the sewing goodies, although Aunt Clara already told me that she wants this one to keep downstairs. Once you're happy with it, glue on the fabric lid. You might also want to add some fabric cording or crochet thread to hide any gap between the lid and the basket. For the handle, I used the same crochet cord from earlier. And don't forget to glue on a little bead for closure. And with that, this tiny sewing basket is complete. It looks like Aunt Clara is getting ready to cut out a new dress. I love how all these tiny pieces bring her story to life. If you end up making any of them, I'd love to hear about it, or tag me on Instagram so I can see what you've created. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.